Welcome to a special edition of Here Comes the Boom. We've been doing this podcast for almost a year now, and we're bringing on a very familiar face who we should have brought on a long time ago. Jack Pilgrim, you know him. Sources say KSR. Jack, how you doing today?
Better now. I thought you were starting to hate me or something. I was wondering when my invite was going to come through, but I guess you can get all the famous people, the people that matter infinitely more than me, and once you get to the bottom of the list and you're desperate for some content, I'm here to come save the day for you.
I had to pick the right spot. We're in prime time of transfer season. There's no better time to bring you on. I didn't want to bring you on during the season. You got the sources say everyone's talking about the basketball team. Nobody cares about recruiting then. People care about recruiting right now, the transfer portal, the current roster. We're going to get into all of that. Let's just start with this current roster because there's supposed to be a lot of players brought back from last year's team. The two guys that everyone's watching right now are Otega Oweh and Brandon Garrison. So what can you say about where things stand with those guys?
Yeah, we can start with the headliner. Obviously, Otega Oweh is the guy that I think every team in college basketball would do whatever it took to get Otega. All SEC talent just explodes onto the scene this past season in Lexington. Really finds his groove as a go-to scorer and you kind of put the team on his back kind of guy. So I think that Kentucky understands his value, and I would be absolutely positively stunned if Kentucky were to lose him to anywhere else. Obviously he has a decision to make in terms of, the draft and whether he's going to test the waters, how extensively he will be testing those waters. But I think there's a lot of optimism internally about Otega Oweh returning for a senior campaign and kind of just being the head of the snake of next year's roster. And then Brendan Garrison's obviously the interesting one because he probably does have a decision to make in terms of, it's going to be a crowded front court. There's a lot of talent joining him. Does he want to find a bigger, more expanded role where he can play 30, 35 minutes a game and kind of be the guy in the front court for another school where he'd probably get a pretty significant pay raise? That's something to monitor. I think there are those close to Brandon that are definitely kind of keeping that in mind while also not ruling out a return. I do think that there is a lot of confidence internally about the future of Brandon Garrison and what he looks like in year two in this system, and just kind of how much they value retention and continuity. How little they had of that this past season. They kind of added Brandon Garrison as one of those future pieces, so it'd be kind of short-sighted on their part to not see the full process through. So I wouldn't be reading the tea leaves of social media behavior or be looking at his academic status and all those things that are kind of just once the gasoline gets poured on the fire on social media, just kind of goes crazy. So I would just kind of take it one step at a time and just know that he does have a decision to make, and it'd be a pretty significant business decision for him to make. That I think it's a pretty firm toss up on Brandon Garrison whether he's back next season or not.
Well, even with those two, if they were to return, Kentucky still has some spots to fill on the roster, 7 graduating seniors. So you've got 4 commits already. I want to get your thoughts on some of these guys, starting with Cam Williams and Jalen Lowe, the first 2 commitments. What do you make of those commitments? What do you think that brought to the class to start things off?
Man, I think Cam Williams is the gem. I think he's kind of one of those diamond in the rough kind of kids where you're banking on his upside and see that he could have some real pro potential. Like there's a very real scenario where he kind of explodes in a the way we talked about Otega Oweh last cycle is, hey, he's a really good player with somebody who's capable of producing, who maybe exceeds expectations. I think Cam Williams can kind of be that guy as the early sleeper for next year's roster, kind of a 3-and-D talent, uber athletic, and just kind of a lot of the physical traits that you look for that to be honest, as last year's roster did not have. So I'm very, very high on Cam Williams. Jalen Lowe, probably the most polarizing addition, I'd say, because you strike out on a couple of those early point guard targets. Kind of feels like Kentucky settled for Jalen Lowe. I don't think that's the case. I think Kentucky was always high on Jalen Lowe. Some local connections there that he's definitely a familiar face for this coaching staff. A guy who produced at the highest level in a very bad conference, and I think people kind of focus more on the competition more so than the production. I think he was a do-it-all, scoring threat who had just a little bit too much on his shoulders to produce, and that's where you saw the efficiency wane a little bit, and that's where you saw the turnovers kind of stack up. So I think if you put talent around him the way Mark Pope is putting talent around him, you're going to get the best version of Jalen Lowe. I think he's going to be a really, really solid, different kind of identity than Lamont Butler as a defensive anchor last season. Definitely more offensive playmaking, that type of identity. So it's going to be a different look from the point guard position, but it's going to be a very good look, in my opinion, for the Cats.
After landing those two guys, Kentucky went out and got Mo Diabate from Alabama. Before we get into talking about Jaden Quaintance, because I know you'll have a lot to say about him, what can you tell me about Mo?
Mo, I've said it a million times now. If you can't beat him, take him. He was one of those guys that Mark Pope, as we saw with Brandon Garrison, as we talk about him, he is the king of getting torched by a kid and saying, all right, I'm tired of getting torched by him. I want him on my roster next go around. So that's exactly what he did with Mo Diabate. Just the physical, long, tough, gritty, diving for loose balls, getting, coming up with tough rebounds, a really, really talented threat in transition, finishes around the rim, and, upside for, shooting, obviously not the prettiest jumper in the world, but 46% is 46%. So there's a lot to like about just the tools and the physicality that Mo Diabate brings. He's a winner. I mean, I remember this time last season when we talked about Lamont Butler when he first arrived, everybody was, going, well, he had shot 60% from the free throw line. He can't shoot. He's, only averaged 8 points a game. Why are we, are we sure this guy can lead? And you just say, well, he just wins games. Like you just bring him in and winning follows him. That's who Mo Diabate is. And I really am a big fan of him. Just that every winning program has a player like Mo Diabate, as we saw the last 2 years under Nate Oates. They won a lot of games, and Mo Diabate was a big part of that.
And I can't have you on this show without asking about Jaden Quaintance. You just talked to him over on KSR. He's a guy that obviously committed to Kentucky out of high school before decommitting after Cal left. So how did this happen? How did Kentucky land Jaden Quaintance, and what's the latest with him?
Man, that was one that it shocked me because, I think Pope could have had him last year in this time last year, but I think there was an understanding that Pope needed to build his roster the way he wanted to, and I think there was kind of a sense on Pope's side that he didn't want to just have Cal hangovers and kind of just wanted a total roster and culture reset, and Quaintance being kind of the unicorn of that class, kind of the prize of John Calipari's Kentucky class the first go round. I think there was just kind of a sense of let's do our own thing, and obviously avoiding the cost of what it would take to bring in Jaden Quaintance. So I think they liked each other last go round, but I think they just wanted to try their own thing. That's part of the reason why Jaden didn't follow Coach Cal to Fayetteville. He wanted his own path, and Mark Pope wanted his own. When they kind of regrouped this offseason, I think they joked a little bit about like, hey, we could have just done this last cycle. I don't know why we didn't, but I think both sides grew a little bit more because of how things unfolded, and they were both mature in their approach with it. And I think though that it kind of put Kentucky ahead, if you will, having the prior experience with one another in that relationship and how things went the first go around, and said, hey, let's not make this same mistake again. We could have done this the first time. Let's do this a second time. So conversations ramped up very quickly. Other schools offered more money, and they turned that down to go to Kentucky and what was deemed a better fit. They love kind of the Amari Williams role, what he was able to do as kind of a point center, if you will, this past season. I think they saw that and they were super intrigued and said, let's kind of fill that role and get on campus and pick up where we left off last offseason.
I will fully admit I was not a huge fan when I found out Kentucky was reaching out to Jaden Quaintance, because I thought that would take them out for Mo Diabate. I think the fact that you land both of those guys is huge. And the fact that they're not done yet is pretty crazy to me. They've still got two big names on the board in addition to others, but I want to ask you about a couple, starting with Lamar Wilkerson. He's set to take visits coming up here. What are you hearing with his recruitment?
Yeah, his has kind of been all over the place, right? Like you've heard different scenarios of, hey, he's a done deal to Indiana. Hey, Arkansas has been lingering and looming, and that home state kid, that's a program that he's really grown up liking, and he's a done deal to Arkansas. then you start to hear some of that scuttlebutt of Kentucky really picking things up as the Wesley Yates kind of recruitment kind of feels to be going down the other path. And we all knew that Washington was a very real threat the entire time, knowing the prior family relationships and, the Quincy Pondexter situation. I think that's one that I'd be monitoring very closely there. But I think it got to the point with Lamar that, when Yates went the other direction, I'd heard elsewhere that they were still, Lamar's side, they were kind of peeking in and just checking in with Kentucky and saying, hey, you guys have that 2 spot filled? Like, how are things going? Any movement there? Is Yates taking it? Who what's your plan there? So they've always kind of had a high level of interest in Kentucky and have been keeping a close eye out there. So when it appeared that Yates was going the other direction, they jumped right in and said, hey, we'd love to, talk to you about potentially, picking up that role and filling that for you guys as a ridiculous shooter, 44% 3-point shooter on high volume, 20 points per game at Sam Houston State. I mean, that's a guy that you can plug into that Kobe Brea role and, expect him to really, really produce at a high level. So I think there's some cautious optimism about where things stand there. And obviously the visits are getting scheduled. I expect him to visit here in the coming days. And, I think the visits are going to come in quick order, and I think a commitment is going to come very shortly after that. So he is definitely atop the sharpshooting wing targets that we've been saying. Hey, there's one spot to fill. Somebody's got to fill it. I would definitely put him atop the list at this point.
Talking atop the list, Alvaro Falgares from Robert Morris is someone that's been talked about for Kentucky this whole transfer cycle. He's still in Spain the last I checked, but Kentucky has been recruiting him pretty hard. So what can you tell me about him?
Yeah, his recruitment's been really interesting. One that, you wonder why things haven't gone more quickly and why it's been as quiet as it has. And I do think that Kentucky has been there from day one. And you talk to people around the program and they've always been aware that he was going to kind of be playing the long game. He was in no rush to make a decision that he would return to the States. He would be taking visits. So I think they've kind of had him on the back burner is just like hey, we know where we stand with one another. When we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And I don't think that there's this top secret plan to hey, we're forcing Brandon Garrison out to bring in Alvaro Falgares. Like, I don't think that that's what this situation is. I just think it's one of those deals where their first priority is to bring back Brandon Garrison. But if it did get to the point where, he explores his options, that Kentucky would be set up in a really, really nice spot to, potentially take over the lead in that recruitment and potentially add his commitment. So I think I feel pretty strongly in saying that Kentucky will have one of Brandon Garrison or Alvaro on the roster next season. Obviously, it's a portal era, so one bag thrown from another school can totally change that for either of those players. But I think Kentucky likes where things stand with that very specific piece in the front court.
Well, Jack, we've talked about a lot of players today. I want to talk for a second about our sponsor, FanStake. I want fans to go ahead and pick your favorite transfer target, transfer addition. Maybe if you want Otega or Brandon to stay, go donate to their FanStake account. Pick your favorite. We'll look next week and see who's leading among the Kentucky players and Kentucky targets. Let's see who Big Blue Nation wants to see in the Kentucky Blue next season. Jack, I want to close it out with our final thought today and get your final thoughts on Kentucky's efforts in the transfer portal. What do you make of the job that Mark Pope has done and what the staff could do to close things out?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that they had some weaknesses on last year's roster with athleticism, some rebounding concerns, some physicality. So just across the board needed to upgrade at some intangibles. They had a lot of skill, a lot of shot making, but I think they needed to add some intangibles. And I think priority number one, getting Cam Williams, getting a Mo Diabate. I think he did a really good job of kind of hitting some of those weak spots of last year's roster while just adding the depth. I think, understanding how things unfolded this past season. I don't think Mark Pope wants to get caught in a situation that he was in to close out the season this past year with an absolute disastrous injury situation. So I think he did a really good job of adding some core depth pieces, pushing to bring back the depth pieces for next year's roster. We'll see, how some of those top end guys, but, making sure that you get the Travis Perrys and Trent Noahs of the world back to, just kind of solidify a really, really strong, deep roster from 1 through 13. So I think Mark Pope's done a really, really good job. If you can add a Lamar Wilkerson and keep keep Brandon Garrison or add an Alvaro, I think this is a national championship contending roster. I really do think it's the one that you can't really point any obvious holes in. No clear weak spots. I think it's one that is going to be as complete as any team in college basketball.
Well, Jack, we'll be following your work. I don't need to tell fans where to find your work. I'm sure they already know, but I'm going to do it anyways. At Jack Pilgrim KSR on X. You can find his work over on on KSR and the KS board. He's posting there every day. And obviously, he's the host of the Sources Say podcast. So you can go right over from here and check out his podcast yesterday with John Smith. Jack, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate you.